the neoconservatives, these very people whom you were just quoting, one of the things they love to say is there's no such thing as a pristine hunter-gatherer society. That you can't prove that any of the hunter-gatherer societies in the ethnographic present have always been hunter-gatherers. And in fact, the evidence is that they reverted from agricultural to a hunter-gatherer economy because they failed as agriculturalists. And this whole hippie-dippie idea about, the purity of hunters and gatherers, that's all nonsense. In fact, they're all failed agriculturalists. And we shouldn't admire hunting and gathering because it just represents failure. That was more or less unwritten part of the message, but it was very clear. So when I first heard this idea about reversion, I was extremely angry because I am a hippie-dippie. I am a man of the '60s. There's no getting around it. Marshall Sahlins, Man the Hunter, Pierre Clasters, all those people who were coming up in the '60s. They're my men. They're my guys. I still follow them to a certain extent. Some revisionism, but basically I'm with them. And so this idea of reversion was anathema to me. I thought it was awful. But then I began to think about it, and I said, well, what if it were true? Then what would that mean? Would it mean that they failed, or would it mean they tried this way of life and decided it was full of shit, And they decided to go back to hunting and gathering because they could be free, they could get rid of the chief, it was taking their extra wheat and becoming a big powerful leader with it. They could no longer have to participate in the new form of warfare where you kill everybody or enslave them, and go back to the more primitive form of warfare, which was mostly about having fun in a violent young man way, and counting coup, for example. As you know, the American Indians just couldn't understand why white people didn't lie down and get out of the battle when they'd been touched by the wand. They're not playing by the rules, And the rules was not to kill too many people. They had small populations. If they ever captured anybody, it was usually women to replace their population, It was a kind of violent form of Levi-Strauss's woman exchange concept. The primitive war was not anything like what came later. Primitive war had a whole different meaning for society than what I call classical war, which begins basically with civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where you enslave the other people and keep them enslaved forever as second-class people, as fellahin, as slaves or serfs. This is the beginning of civilization. This is the world that we still know and that most of us think always existed. But if you've studied anthropology and archaeology, you know that that's not true, that there were, for anywhere from 40,000 to 1,000,000 years, depending on how you define humans, there were human societies that did not have authoritarian structures. And they were almost invariably based on hunting and gathering or primitive agriculture. Where I differ with Marshall Sahlins is I don't have such a critique of domestication. This is also a point with Zerzan, for example. I love Zerzan's work. I've learned a lot from it. We consider ourselves comrades, but there are points that I think he's too extreme about. If we really want to accomplish something in this lifetime, there isn't so much point in criticizing language the way John does, as for example, in criticizing capitalism and trying to think of some kind of actual viable alternative that would actually work, So what I like about their work, I've extended, what I like about their work about the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age of hunting and gathering and complete, you might say, tribal anarchy, we presume. I tried to carry it into the Neolithic period and point out that the state doesn't emerge until the end of the Neolithic, right? It clearly is not horticulture or primitive agriculture that causes the state to appear, because for 10,000 years we have societies based on domestication where the state does not emerge. The state emerges, as far as we can see, because a few more crucial factors came into play, metallurgy being a very important one. In other words, technology in the modern sense, irrigation, and therefore the idea of a permanent surplus, that if you controlled it, you would have political power. So these two things I see as the turning point, which allowed what I call the first coup d'etat, which was the emergence of the state. I'm sure it had been tried before, because as Pierre Clasters says, primitive societies are not made up of goody-goody people who all love each other all the time. They know the danger of hierarchy, and they organize their society against it. That's the idea of Society Against the State by Clasters, which you should read if you haven't read. And also the book we published by him, Archaeology of Violence, in which he explains about primitive war. These are very important books. Too few people have read them. So I have this idea as a Luddite that we can have technology if it's appropriate technology, or we can have techne if it's appropriate techne. We could be Luddites rather than primitivists, at least as a step along the way of getting back to the Stone Age situation, which we all, I'm perfectly willing to admit that sounds like the best idea to me. But failing that, and since we now have zillions of people who need to be fed, we've got to come to some kind of terms with agriculture. What could it be? Permaculture is a very strong possibility. We know there are models out there that are not nearly as destructive as industrial agriculture, since the Mesopotamia, what I would call the Babylonian model of agriculture. And we know that what the Luddites were talking about was that if machinery, this is a phrase right out of a Luddite letter, one of their anonymous letters, machinery hurtful to the commonalty, the commonality, as we would say nowadays, in other words, the commons. Machinery which is hurtful to the commons, that's the machinery they wanted to smash. Not all machinery. They had their own hand looms they were making their living with. They weren't going to smash those. It was the mechanical looms that took their jobs away and destroyed their society, their community. That's what they didn't like. And that's what they were rebelling against. So I'm proposing this kind of green Luddite anarchist horticulture model, which would mean an intelligent form of domestication, one in which we no longer looked on ourselves as the lords of creation, but the collaborators with nature. And in certain traditional societies, I've seen in my travels, certain models that looked attractive from this point of view. Usually they've been damaged by hundreds of years of capitalism and imperialism, but you can still, in the outback of India or Afghanistan or God knows where, South America I suppose, but my knowledge is very limited, you can still come across real communities, that are not starving to death, that have, to a certain extent, solve the problem of wealth, and what has enabled them to do that is actually their failure to join modern society and to embrace modern technology. So the fact that they're too poor to buy trucks or TVs, and that they're still using bullock carts, and horse-drawn plows or whatever it might be, has actually preserved their community and given me as a visitor a real thrill in seeing a group of people who are so unlike what I'm used to, and that they're all, together. I was going to say happy together, but that's clearly not true, because happiness is not guaranteed by any social system. And neither is purity of heart, neither is innocence or any of those things. And if the hippies believed in some of those things, well, we were wrong. But we were wrong for a good reason, for a nice reason, not for a nasty reason, But now I would like a more nuanced reading of the past. Anyway, that's what I told them at Columbia, and they were very glad to hear that they didn't have to, that I was sort of giving them permission not to be oppressed by the neoconservative academics, that they have been in charge for 25 years now, at least, telling these people that all of these ideas are hippie bullshit, and get over it. It's been a struggle since the beginning. Human beings are not good. They must be controlled. These are the unwritten messages that these academics have been giving us. And boy, are the young people are sick of them. And I'm beginning to have some hopes that maybe the youth will pull out of this cyber daze that they're in, and actually begin to resist again.